There is a kind of wealth that almost nobody audits. It doesn't appear on any balance sheet, it isn't tracked by any app on your phone, and no financial advisor has ever sat across from you and asked how you're managing it. Yet every person who has ever built something meaningful, a career that commands respect, a business that endures, a body of work that outlasts the moment, has understood, at some level, that this resource was the one they could least afford to waste. The resource is attention. Not time, precisely, though the two are related. Attention is something more specific, more human, and more fragile than time. You can have 24 hours in a day and spend all of them in a fog. You can be physically present in a room for an entire decade and never truly arrive. Time passes whether you inhabit it or not. Attention is different. Attention is the quality of your presence, the direction of your mental energy, the thing that transforms raw hours into actual output, actual relationships, actual progress. And most people are hemorrhaging it. Here is the tension at the center of everything that follows. We live in a civilization that has become extraordinarily sophisticated at helping people accumulate money and extraordinarily reckless about how it treats human attention. There are entire industries, worth trillions of dollars, staffed by the most talented engineers and psychologists alive today, whose singular purpose is to capture your focus and hold it for as long as possible, not to enrich you, not to advance your goals, to hold your gaze long enough to sell it to someone else. That is the transaction happening every time you open a social media feed, every time you respond to a notification within seconds of it arriving, every time you let a meeting run 40 minutes past its natural conclusion because nobody had the authority to end it. You are the product being sold. Your attention is the commodity being traded. And the extraordinary irony is that the people building these systems are, by and large, not using them. The architects of the attention economy are famously protective of their own focus. This asymmetry is worth sitting with for a moment. Why would the people who understand most clearly how these systems work be the same people most determined to limit their own exposure to them? The obvious answer is that they know something most of their users don't. Not a conspiracy, not a secret, something simpler and more uncomfortable than that. They understand the actual cost. When you spend 2 hours scrolling through content that was algorithmically designed to hold you just long enough to feel satisfied, but never long enough to feel full, you haven't simply passed the time. You have spent 2 hours of cognitive energy that could have been directed toward a skill you're building, a problem you're solving, a relationship you're deepening, and you have received almost nothing durable in return. Not nothing, but almost nothing. The ratio of input to output is staggering. Most people intuitively sense this, which is why there's a low-grade guilt that often accompanies heavy phone use or a morning lost to low-priority tasks. But sensing a cost and truly reckoning with it are very different things. We are remarkably good at ignoring costs that are diffuse and delayed. The damage done by a single distracted morning is invisible. The damage done by 10 years of distracted mornings is the career that never quite reached its potential, the book that was always being written, the capability that was always being developed but somehow never arrived. That is the kind of cost that only becomes legible in retrospect, and by then the compounding has already done its quiet work. What separates the people this book is about, the ones who seem to operate at a different frequency, who produce more, think more clearly, build more deliberately, is not that they have more hours. It's that they have made a private, often unspoken decision about where their attention is going to go. This decision doesn't always look dramatic from the outside. It rarely announces itself. It manifests instead as a pattern of small choices. The meeting declined, the notification silenced, the conversation gently redirected, the morning hour protected with an almost religious consistency. These are not the behaviors of people who are antisocial or cold or indifferent to the world around them. They are the behaviors of people who understand something about scarcity that most of their peers have not yet absorbed. Attention is finite. Not just in the sense that your day has a fixed number of hours, but in a deeper neurological sense that we will explore later in this journey. The capacity for genuine, high-quality cognitive engagement is not a renewable resource that refills completely each morning. It depletes, it degrades under certain conditions, it thrives under others. And the people who have internalized this fact, who have made it not just an intellectual acknowledgement, but a behavioral reality, tend to be the people whose work carries a weight, a depth, and a consistency that sets them apart from peers of comparable intelligence. There is a word for this that rarely gets used in productivity circles, perhaps because it sounds too intense, too monastic, too at odds with the modern ideal of the cheerfully connected professional. The word is obsession, not the pathological kind, not the obsession that narrows a person's world until it collapses, but the quiet kind, the kind that looks from a distance like calm, the kind that is actually a ferocious, disciplined, ongoing commitment to keeping your most important mental resource pointed at the things that matter most to you. The quiet obsession. It is not about doing less. It is about caring, with extraordinary consistency, about where your mind actually goes. The question this raises, and it is the question that will drive everything that follows, is this: if attention is truly the most valuable thing you have, why do so few people treat it that way? What are the forces working against that kind of guardianship? And what does it actually look like in practical human terms to protect your focus the way the most effective people on earth have learned to protect theirs? Those answers begin somewhere unexpected, not with productivity systems or morning routines. They begin with what high performers are quietly choosing not to do. There is a particular kind of morning that high performers seem to share, and it is not the one that gets written about in most success-oriented books. The version that gets celebrated tends to involve a precise sequence of habits: cold exposure, journaling, exercise, meditation, all before 7 a.m. Executed with military discipline and documented for an audience. That version exists, and for some people it is genuine. But beneath the performance of it, beneath the version that gets shared, there is something quieter and more fundamental happening for the people who are actually producing at the highest levels over long periods of time. What they are doing, before almost anything else, is protecting the first hours of their cognitive day from the demands of other people. This is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the central act. Because the morning hours, specifically the window before your mind has been colonized by the requests, reactions, and ambient noise of the social world, are when the brain's capacity for deep, original, and generative thinking is at its peak. Neuroscientists have documented this in considerable detail, and we will get into the mechanics of why in a later section. But the behavioral reality is visible without any laboratory equipment. Ask almost any person who has built a serious body of work, a novelist, a founder, a senior executive who is known for the quality of their thinking rather than the volume of their output. And they will describe in varying language the same essential practice. The first hours belong to them, not to email, not to the news cycle, not to the overnight messages that arrived while they slept, not to the ambient scroll of other people's priorities presenting themselves as urgent. The first hours belong to whatever work requires the most of them, the problem that demands original thought, the strategy that needs uninterrupted development, the writing or designing or deciding that cannot be done well in the gaps between distractions. This is the practice. And it is more radical than it sounds because it runs directly against the grain of what most professional environments reward. Most workplaces, most organizational cultures operate on an implicit assumption that availability equals commitment. The person who responds to messages at 6 in the morning is seen as dedicated. The person who is reachable on weekends signals that they care. The person who attends every meeting, volunteers for every initiative, and maintains an open-door policy in the most literal sense is often perceived as a team player, a leader, someone invested in the collective effort. And there is something real in that perception. Connection, collaboration, and responsiveness are genuine virtues. But the assumption, hiding underneath all of it, is that presence and productivity are the same thing. They are not. They have almost nothing to do with each other. The people who understand this most clearly tend to have reached a point in their careers where they have enough standing to push back against the availability norm without paying a severe social cost. But here is what is interesting. The guardianship of attention didn't begin when they gained that standing. In almost every case, when you trace the arc backward, The protection of focused work time began much earlier, often before it was socially safe to do it, and it was one of the things that created the standing in the first place. The causality runs in a direction most people don't expect. They assume you earn the right to focus by first proving your worth through availability. The reality is closer to the opposite. You prove your worth by producing work of unusual quality, and that quality requires the kind of focus that availability destroys. This is where the behavior starts to look less like a lifestyle preference and more like a deeply held conviction. Because if you watch how genuinely high-performing people talk about their time, not on stages or in interviews designed to produce quotable advice, but in the private decisions they make day after day, what you observe is something that has the quality of a value rather than a habit. They are not simply managing their schedule efficiently. They are operating from a belief about what their attention is for. It is for the work that only they can do. It is for the thinking that cannot be delegated, the judgment that cannot be automated, the creative or strategic contribution that is, in some sense, their actual job, as opposed to the administrative layer of tasks that surrounds every job and can easily be mistaken for the job itself. This distinction between the core work and the surrounding layer is one that high performers make constantly, often instinctively, and that most people almost never make explicitly. The calendar fills with meetings, the inbox demands response, the group chat generates a low hum of requests and reactions that can absorb hours without producing anything, and all of it feels productive because it is busy, because it involves other people, because it generates the social feedback of participation. But very little of it is the thing. Very little of it is the work that 5 years from now will have mattered. What the people this book examines have figured out, some through deliberate strategy, some through painful trial and error, some through a disposition they can barely articulate, is how to keep a clear line between those two categories. And they defend that line not because they are selfish or disengaged, but because they have understood something about the economics of their own cognition that most of their peers are still working out. Their attention is not a courtesy they extend to whoever asks for it. It is a resource they invest, deliberately, in the places where it will generate the most durable return. The next question is an uncomfortable one. If this is what high performers actually do, why is so much of the modern professional world designed to make it nearly impossible? The answer involves a set of forces that most people experience every day without ever naming them clearly. Consider what happens in the average professional's day before they have made a single deliberate choice. The alarm sounds, and within minutes, sometimes seconds, a hand reaches for a phone. Not out of laziness or weakness, but out of habit so deeply grooved it no longer registers as a choice at all. The screen lights up with a small civilization of demands, messages that arrived overnight, notifications from apps that have been learning your preferences for years, headlines engineered to provoke a response, a calendar reminder for a meeting that was scheduled by someone else for a time that suits someone else's priorities. And before the first cup of coffee has been poured, before a single intentional thought has been formed about what this day is actually for, the mind has already been distributed across a dozen competing claims on its energy. The tax has already been collected. The day has already been partially spent. This is not metaphor. This is the literal mechanics of how attention gets extracted in the modern environment, and the extraction is systematic, cumulative, and largely invisible to the people it's happening to. Understanding it requires stepping back from the individual morning and looking at the architecture of the system that morning exists inside. Because what has been built around us, the platforms, the notification systems, the communication norms, the always-on professional culture, is not neutral infrastructure. It is infrastructure optimized for a very specific outcome, and that outcome is not your productivity, your clarity, or your long-term development. It is engagement, your engagement, measured in seconds, minutes, and hours of captured attention that can be converted into advertising revenue, behavioral data, and platform growth. The people who designed these systems are not villains. Most of them were solving genuine problems. How do you help people stay connected, access information quickly, collaborate across distances? The solutions they built were real solutions. But the incentive structures underneath those solutions created something that was not part of the original intention. When a platform's revenue depends on how long users spend on it, the platform will inevitably optimize for time on platform above all other values, including the user's own well-being or productivity. This is not a conspiracy. It is just the logic of the incentive, playing out at scale, over time, with extraordinary sophistication. The sophistication is worth pausing on. The systems that compete for your attention today are not static, they are adaptive. They are informed by decades of behavioral research, by real-time data on what you respond to, by psychological principles that were originally developed to understand human motivation and have since been applied to the engineering of compulsion. The variable reward schedule, the same mechanism that makes gambling difficult to stop, is embedded in the architecture of every major social platform. You don't know if the next scroll will produce something interesting or something dull, and that uncertainty, that intermittent reinforcement, is precisely what makes the behavior so difficult to interrupt voluntarily. It was designed to be difficult to interrupt, that is the point. But social platforms are only the most visible layer of the attention tax. Inside professional environments, the extraction continues through different mechanisms. The open plan office, celebrated for decades as a driver of collaboration and spontaneous innovation, has also been documented extensively as an environment that makes sustained concentration nearly impossible. Research on workplace interruption has consistently found that the average knowledge worker is interrupted or self-interrupts roughly every 3 to 5 minutes during the workday. Each interruption doesn't simply pause the work, it resets a cognitive process that takes, on average, more than 20 minutes to fully restore. The mathematics of this are staggering. If you are interrupted 12 times in a morning and each interruption costs 20 minutes of recovery time, the total cognitive debt exceeds 4 hours in a 4-hour morning. The math produces a workday that is, in terms of genuine deep output, nearly empty, even as it feels relentlessly busy. The busyness is real, the output is thin, and the gap between those two facts is where enormous amounts of human potential quietly disappear. This is not a problem of laziness or lack of effort. It is a structural problem built into the design of the environments where most people spend the majority of their waking hours. And because the busyness is visible, while the lost depth is invisible, most organizations never diagnose it correctly. They see people working hard and assume the output will follow. They add more meetings to coordinate the hard work. They implement more communication tools to keep everyone aligned. Each solution adds another layer of the very problem it was meant to solve. What makes this dynamic particularly insidious is that the attention tax compounds. A single distracted day is recoverable. A distracted month begins to show. A distracted year starts to reshape what a person believes they are capable of. Because the ability to concentrate deeply is not simply a setting you can toggle back on after years of fragmentation. It is, in a meaningful sense, a skill. One that atrophies without practice, one that can be rebuilt but requires deliberate effort to rebuild, and one whose absence tends to be attributed to personality or intelligence rather than to the environmental conditions that systematically trained it out of existence. This is the part that most conversations about productivity miss entirely. They treat distraction as a personal failing to be corrected through willpower. They prescribe disciplines and systems as though the problem were one of individual inadequacy. But the person who struggles to concentrate in a modern open-plan office, surrounded by notification-generating devices, operating inside a culture that rewards responsiveness over reflection, that person is not failing. They are responding rationally to an environment that was not designed for deep work. The environment is the problem, and changing the outcome requires changing the environment, not simply hardening the will against it. Which raises a question that the most effective people seem to have answered, each in their own way, long before it became a mainstream conversation. If the environment extracts attention by default, what does it take to build one that protects it instead? There is a status game being played in most professional environments, and almost nobody is talking about it openly. It operates through signals that are so normalized, so woven into the fabric of workplace culture, that they have come to feel like simple descriptions of reality rather than what they actually are. performances of a particular kind of value. The signal in question is busyness, and the game it sustains is one of the most quietly destructive forces in modern professional life, because it has managed to invert the relationship between effort and output in a way that punishes the very behaviors that produce exceptional work. Watch how busyness gets communicated in a typical organization. It travels through language: the colleague who responds to "How are you?" with an inventory of their current workload, the executive who begins every meeting by noting how little time they have, the professional who carbon copies 12 people on every email to demonstrate the breadth of their involvement. It travels through behavior: the person who sends messages at 11 at night, not because the matter is urgent, but because the timestamp communicates dedication. The person who schedules back-to-back meetings from 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening, and then mentions, with a particular kind of exhausted pride, that they haven't had time to eat. These are not simply descriptions of a demanding schedule. They are social broadcasts. They are saying something about identity, about importance, about belonging to a class of people whose time is in such high demand that they can barely contain the pressure of it. The sociologist Ali Hochschild wrote about the way overwork became a marker of class in America, a phenomenon that intensified through the latter decades of the 20th century and has only accelerated since. In an earlier era, leisure was the status signal. The aristocrat demonstrated power through the conspicuous absence of obligation. But as knowledge work became the dominant form of professional life, and as the outputs of that work became harder to measure directly, busyness stepped in as the visible proxy for value. If you are overwhelmed, the logic goes, it must be because you are needed. If you are needed, you must be valuable. The chain of inference is rarely examined, but it governs an enormous amount of professional behavior. The problem is that the chain is broken. Being overwhelmed does not mean you are doing the most important work. It frequently means the opposite, that the boundaries between important and unimportant work have collapsed, that everything has been allowed to feel equally urgent, and that the resulting pressure is being worn as a badge rather than addressed as a dysfunction. The people who are genuinely producing at the highest level in any field tend not to describe themselves as overwhelmed. They describe themselves as focused. The distinction is not semantic. It reflects a completely different relationship with demand, one where the incoming flow of requests, tasks, and obligations has been actively filtered rather than passively absorbed. But here is where the social dynamics become genuinely complicated, because opting out of the busyness performance carries a cost, particularly early in a career, and particularly in organizations where availability is conflated with commitment. The person who leaves at 5 o'clock while colleagues are still visibly working, the person who doesn't respond to weekend messages, the person who declines meetings with senior leaders because those meetings conflict with protected work time, these people are taking a social risk. They are deviating from the norm in ways that can be read by those committed to the norm as arrogance, indifference, or lack of team spirit. The professional world is deeply social, and social worlds punish visible deviation from their operating codes. This is precisely why the attention-guarding behaviors of genuinely high performers tend to be quiet rather than loud. They are not, for the most part, people who announce their philosophy in meetings or write manifestos about the importance of deep work. They simply do it with a consistency that becomes its own kind of reputation over time. The work speaks. The quality of the output, sustained over months and years, builds a credibility that eventually allows the behavior to be read differently, not as indifference, but as discipline, not as arrogance, but as standards. The social cost doesn't disappear, but it becomes manageable, and eventually it inverts into a form of respect that most people spend their entire careers chasing through the wrong means. What is also true, and less comfortable, is that the busyness performance actively selects against the behaviors that produce exceptional work. Organizations that reward visibility over output will, over time, attract and retain people who are skilled at visibility. They will lose or fail to recognize the people who are quietly doing the work that matters most. This is a structural problem with consequences that extend far beyond the individual. It is why certain institutions seem to generate enormous activity and modest results. It is why some of the most productive people in any industry are often found at its edges rather than its centers. not because they lack ambition, but because they have refused to pay the attention tax that membership in the center demands. There is a particular kind of power that accrues to the person who has genuinely opted out of the busyness performance while remaining fully engaged with the work itself. It is not loud power. It is not the power of constant visibility or social momentum. It is the power that comes from being the person in the room whose thinking is clearly different in quality from the ambient noise, whose contributions, when they arrive, carry a weight that the contributions of the perpetually busy rarely achieve. That kind of power is built in silence, over time, through the accumulated compound interest of protected attention. The question it raises is one that cuts against one of the most deeply held beliefs in professional culture. What if being less available made you more valuable? What if the very thing you've been trained to offer freely is the thing you should be most reluctant to give away? Cut open a moment of genuine deep focus and examine what is actually happening inside the brain, and what you find is not what most people imagine. The popular conception of concentration tends toward the mechanical, a kind of mental narrowing, a funneling of awareness onto a single point, like tightening a lens. That image captures something real, but it misses the more extraordinary thing that happens when the brain is given the conditions it needs to operate at its fullest capacity. Deep focus is not a restriction of the brain's activity. It is an expansion of it. And understanding why that is true changes the way you think about everything the previous sections have described. The brain, even at rest, is never truly quiet. There is a network of regions, the default mode network neuroscientists call it, that becomes highly active precisely when external demands are low, when you are not responding to stimuli, not reacting to inputs, not processing the immediate environment. For a long time, this network was considered a kind of neural idling, the brain's version of a screensaver. What decades of subsequent research revealed was something far more interesting. The default mode network is where the brain does some of its most important work. It is active during autobiographical memory, during future planning, during moral reasoning, during the construction of complex social understanding, and, crucially, during the kind of associative, non-linear thinking that produces original insight. It is, in a meaningful sense, where ideas come from, and it is almost completely suppressed by the conditions of the modern attention environment. Every notification, every interruption, every demand for immediate response pushes the brain out of the default mode and into reactive processing, the neural equivalent of customer service, handling inputs as they arrive, processing and responding, processing and responding. This mode is necessary, it is not inferior, but it is categorically different from the mode that generates the thinking that changes things. And when the reactive mode dominates the day, which it does for most knowledge workers most of the time, the generative mode barely gets a turn. The ideas that might have arrived, the connections that might have been made, the strategic insights that might have clarified a difficult problem. They do not announce their own absence. They simply never appear. There is a concept in cognitive psychology called cognitive load, the total amount of mental processing active at any given moment. The brain has a working memory capacity that is, by evolutionary standards, remarkably limited. Most research suggests that humans can hold approximately 4 chunks of information in active working memory simultaneously, and complex reasoning requires the manipulation of multiple chunks in relation to each other. When the cognitive load is high, when the mind is tracking multiple ongoing conversations, pending tasks, unresolved social dynamics, and background anxieties simultaneously, the available space for complex reasoning shrinks. Not because the person is less intelligent, but because the architecture of working memory is finite, and it is already occupied. This is the neurological reality behind the experience that every serious thinker has described in some form. The feeling that the best thinking happens when everything else goes quiet. It is not mysticism. It is the brain's working memory being freed from the ambient load of a fragmented environment and redirected toward a single demanding problem. When that happens, something qualitatively different becomes possible. The brain can hold more of a complex problem in mind simultaneously. It can see relationships between parts of the problem that would be invisible in a fragmented state. It can sustain the kind of iterative, recursive processing turning the problem over, examining it from different angles, allowing partial solutions to develop and be tested. That is the actual mechanism of non-trivial intellectual work. The psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi spent decades studying the experience his research subjects described when they were doing their best work, the state he eventually named flow. What characterized flow was not simply enjoyment or engagement, though both were present. It was a specific cognitive condition, the complete absorption of attention in a task that was calibrated to the outer edge of the person's current ability. Not so easy that the mind wandered. Not so difficult that anxiety overwhelmed the process. Right at the edge, where the challenge and the capability were in dynamic tension, and where the result was a quality of mental engagement that his subjects, regardless of their field or background, consistently described as among the most satisfying experiences of their lives. Surgeons, chess players, rock climbers, composers, mathematicians, farmers. The phenomenology was remarkably consistent across wildly different domains. What Csikszentmihalyi also found, and what is less frequently cited, is that flow states were vanishingly rare in the daily lives of most of his subjects, not because they lacked the capacity, but because the conditions required to enter that state were almost never present. The conditions, it turns out, are not exotic. They are simple to describe and difficult to create in a modern environment. Uninterrupted time, a clear goal, immediate feedback from the work itself. The absence of social monitoring, the feeling of not being observed or evaluated, which activates self-consciousness and disrupts the absorption that flow requires. These conditions are precisely what the attention economy, the open plan office, and the always-on communication culture systematically eliminate. This is the hidden cost that never appears in any productivity report. Not the hours lost to distraction, those are visible, at least in principle, but the flow states that never happened. The insights that required 30 minutes of uninterrupted thinking to arrive, but never got those 30 minutes. The work that could have been done at the edge of someone's capability, but was done instead in the gaps between interruptions, at a level comfortably below what they were actually capable of. Over a career, that gap between what was produced and what could have been produced is not a small number. It is the distance between a competent professional and an exceptional one, which raises an obvious question. If the brain's capacity for deep, generative, flow-state thinking is this powerful, and if the conditions required to access it are this specific, what do the people who access it most reliably actually know? There is a practice that some of the most formidable thinkers in modern history have shared, and it is one that tends to make people uncomfortable when they first encounter it. Not because it is extreme, but because it contradicts something most of us were taught to value. The practice is deliberate ignorance. Not the passive ignorance of someone who simply hasn't gotten around to reading the news, but the active, considered, principled decision to not know certain things. To build walls, consciously and without apology, around the information that is allowed to enter the mind. To treat the inputs to your thinking with the same discrimination you would apply to the outputs of it. And to understand that what you choose not to know is as important a cognitive decision as what you choose to study deeply. This idea sits uncomfortably against the modern professional identity, which tends to prize being informed. There is a social expectation, particularly in ambitious circles, that the serious person is a well-read person, someone who is across the news, current on the relevant literature in their field, aware of the major conversations happening in their industry, and capable of speaking intelligently to a wide range of topics at any given moment. Being informed signals intelligence. It signals engagement with the world. It signals the kind of broad awareness that seems, on the surface, like the natural complement to deep expertise. Why would anyone voluntarily narrow that? The answer begins with a question about what information actually does once it enters the mind. Most people treat information as neutral, as raw material that sits passively in memory until it is needed. But that is not how cognition works. Information is not passive. Every piece of data the mind absorbs creates associations, generates emotional responses, occupies working memory, and influences the framing of subsequent problems. The news cycle, specifically, is engineered to produce information that is emotionally activating, that provokes anxiety, outrage, urgency, or tribal loyalty. Because emotionally activating content holds attention more effectively than neutral content. Consuming it daily does not simply inform you about the world. It trains your nervous system toward a particular kind of reactivity, and it populates your cognitive background with a persistent hum of unresolved concerns that have nothing to do with the problems you are actually trying to solve. Charles Darwin is a useful example here. The scale of what Darwin produced, not just the theory of evolution by natural selection, but the decades of meticulous follow-on work that supported, extended, and defended it, was made possible in part by what he did not allow to colonize his thinking. Darwin's daily schedule at Down House was famously structured around periods of walking and thinking that were protected from social interruption. He read selectively and deeply, rather than broadly and reactively. He was not uninformed about his world, but he was ruthlessly discriminating about what he allowed to claim his sustained attention. The result was a quality of concentrated intellectual development over decades that produced one of the most consequential bodies of scientific work in human history. The focus was not incidental to the achievement, it was constitutive of it. Warren Buffett has described a similar logic in the context of investment decisions, though the principle extends far beyond finance. His observation that the difference between successful people and very successful people is that very successful people say no to almost everything is, at its core, a statement about information and attention management as much as it is about opportunity selection. Every additional piece of information you allow into your decision-making process is another variable your mind has to manage, another source of potential noise contaminating the signal, another claim on the cognitive resources that sustained, original thinking requires. The discipline of selective ignorance is the discipline of keeping the signal-to-noise ratio high enough that genuine insight remains possible. This is not anti-intellectualism. The distinction matters enormously. The person practicing strategic ignorance is not avoiding difficult ideas or complex truths. They are typically reading more deeply, thinking more carefully, and engaging more seriously with the ideas that fall within their chosen domain than the person who skims broadly across everything. What they are avoiding is the low-resolution, high-volume, emotionally activating information stream that the modern media environment produces by default. The information equivalent of processed food, engineered for immediate palatability, and largely devoid of the nutrients that serious thinking requires. The psychologist and Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman spent much of his career documenting the ways that irrelevant information contaminates decision-making, a phenomenon he called anchoring, among other things. The mind, it turns out, cannot simply ignore information it has been exposed to, even when explicitly told to disregard it, even when the person consciously understands it is irrelevant. Exposure itself is the contamination, which means the only reliable defense against the distorting effects of bad information is to not encounter it in the first place. Selective ignorance is not a workaround. It is, given the architecture of human cognition, the only strategy that actually works. What makes this practice genuinely difficult is that it requires tolerating a specific kind of social discomfort, the discomfort of not having an opinion about something that your peers are currently animated about. The news cycle produces a rhythm of collective concern, and deviating from that rhythm can feel like social exile. When everyone in a room has a view about some current controversy, and you have deliberately chosen not to engage with it, there is a pressure, subtle, persistent, and sometimes not so subtle, to catch up, to form a view, to participate in the shared agitation. Resisting that pressure requires a clarity about why you made the choice you made, and a confidence in the value of what that choice protects. The people who have developed that confidence tend to share a particular characteristic. They are not indifferent to the world. They are often more genuinely engaged with it than most, but on their own terms, through their own chosen lenses, at a depth that the broad but shallow approach never reaches. They have understood that knowing fewer things more deeply is not a limitation. Deployed with intention, it is one of the most significant cognitive advantages available. But knowing what not to know is only part of the picture. How you deploy attention in social situations, in rooms, in relationships, in the live performance of professional life, turns out to carry its own strategic weight entirely. Walk into any room where power is present and watch what happens with attention. Not the formal power of titles and org charts, but the real thing, the kind that shapes how people position their bodies, who interrupts whom, whose silence draws more curiosity than other people's words. What you will notice, if you watch carefully enough, is that the people who command the most genuine authority in that room are almost never the ones distributing their attention most freely. They are the ones making you work for it. Their eye contact, when it lands on you, carries weight precisely because it is not perpetually available. Their engagement, when it arrives, feels like something because it is clearly not given to everyone equally. Their attention, in other words, is behaving exactly like a scarce resource, and scarcity in social dynamics, as in economics, creates value. This is not a manipulation technique. It is a description of something that operates whether or not anyone is conscious of it, something rooted in evolutionary psychology and expressed across every human culture that has ever been studied. Status, in social primates, is communicated through patterns of attention, specifically through the asymmetry of who watches whom. Lower status individuals monitor higher status individuals closely and continuously, tracking their moods, anticipating their responses, calibrating behavior in relation to theirs. Higher status individuals do not reciprocate this monitoring with equal intensity. They are attended to more than they attend. This asymmetry is not simply a symptom of status. It is one of its primary signals. It is how the social group reads and reinforces the hierarchy through the continuous microlanguage of where eyes go and how long they stay. What this means in practical terms is that how you deploy your attention in social and professional settings is communicating your perceived status constantly, whether or not you are aware of it. The person who responds to every message within minutes signals that they are monitoring others closely, that they are in a waiting, attending posture rather than a directing one. The person who laughs at every joke in the room signals a constant orientation towards social approval. The person who volunteers eye contact and engagement to anyone who approaches, without selectivity, is broadcasting a social availability that the high-status individual's behavior consistently withholds. None of this is about being cold or dismissive. It is about understanding that attention has social valence, and that the way it is given or withheld shapes how others construct their understanding of who you are and what kind of person they are dealing with. The most socially sophisticated people in any environment have internalized this understanding so deeply that it no longer operates as a strategy. It has become a disposition. They are genuinely selective with their attention, not because they are performing selectivity, but because they have developed authentic standards for what deserves their engagement. And that authenticity is precisely what makes the behavior legible as status rather than as rudeness. There is a felt difference in any social interaction between a person who is withholding attention because they are insecure and a person who is withholding it because they are genuinely engaged elsewhere. The latter carries an ease, a groundedness, a quality of self-containment that the former never quite achieves. The performance of unavailability is always visible. The genuine article is something else entirely. This dynamic plays out with particular consequence in professional conversations and negotiations. Research on persuasion and influence has consistently found that the party in any negotiation who is more emotionally invested, who needs the outcome more, who is more visibly anxious about how things will go, is the party with less leverage. Emotional investment is visible through attention, through the forward lean, the rapid response, the filling of silence with words, the compulsive monitoring of the other person's reactions, the person who can sit comfortably in silence after making a proposal, who does not rush to fill the space with concessions and reassurances, who appears genuinely untroubled by the possibility that the conversation might not go their way. That person is communicating, through the language of attention and presence, that they have options. And having options, or appearing to have them, is the foundational condition of leverage. In conversations at every level of professional life, the same principle applies. The person who listens more than they speak tends to be perceived as more intelligent, more thoughtful, and more trustworthy than the person who fills the air. This is a well-documented phenomenon, but its mechanism is often misunderstood. It is not simply that silence creates an impression of depth. It is that genuine high-quality listening, the kind that is fully present rather than waiting for its turn to speak, is actually rare enough that when people encounter it, they respond to it powerfully. They feel seen, they feel understood, they are drawn toward the person who offered that quality of attention with an intensity that no amount of talking produces. The most socially effective people are not the most articulate. They are the most present. There is a particular skill that sits at the intersection of all of this, one that takes years to develop and that is almost never explicitly taught. It is the ability to be fully in a conversation, genuinely curious, genuinely engaged, bringing real cognitive resources to what the other person is saying, while simultaneously maintaining a kind of internal separation from the social pressure the conversation generates. To care about the person without needing their approval. To be interested without being anxious about the outcome. This combination, full presence with inner detachment, is what the most effective communicators and leaders consistently embody, and it is extraordinarily difficult to fake because it is not primarily a behavioral technique. It is a state of mind that arises from a particular relationship with your own attention, one where you know where it comes from, you understand its value, and you give it as a genuine choice rather than a reflexive response to social demand. Understanding this changes the way you walk into rooms. It changes what you notice, what you offer, and what you withhold. But it also points toward a deeper question, one about the physical and structural conditions that make this quality of presence possible to begin with. Most people have never audited their environment for attention. They have audited it for comfort, for aesthetics, for practical functionality. Does the desk have enough space? Is the chair ergonomic? Is the lighting adequate? But they have not asked the question that turns out to matter most. Does this environment make deep focus easier or harder? And the reason they haven't asked it is the same reason fish don't analyze water. The environment is so continuous, so thoroughly the medium of daily experience, that it becomes effectively invisible. You stop seeing the open browser tabs and start seeing only the screen. You stop noticing the background noise and start filtering it as ambient. You stop registering the psychological weight of the unread messages piling up in the peripheral awareness and start carrying that weight as a kind of permanent low-grade tension that you have simply come to accept as the baseline condition of professional life. The architecture of your attention, the term deserves to be taken literally, is the sum of all the environmental, structural, and relational conditions that either support or undermine your capacity for sustained focus. It includes the physical space where you work, the devices you use and how they are configured, the people who have access to you and under what conditions, the rhythms of your day and who controls them, and the psychological agreements, explicit or implicit, you have made with your environment about what is allowed to interrupt you and when. Most people have an attention architecture. They simply have never designed it. It assembled itself, piece by piece, through accumulated defaults and social obligations, and the result is almost invariably an environment optimized for everything except the work that matters most. The physical dimension of this is the most immediately actionable and also the most frequently discussed, so it is worth moving through it quickly to get to the layers underneath. The basic principles are well established. Single tasking outperforms multitasking on every meaningful measure of cognitive output. Notification-free work periods produce dramatically higher quality results than interrupted ones. Visual clutter and environmental complexity consume low-level cognitive resources that would otherwise be available for the primary task. Natural light, moderate temperature, and low ambient noise support sustained concentration in ways that their opposites measurably do not. These are not controversial findings. They are replicated, practical, and almost universally ignored in the design of modern workplaces and home offices alike. Knowing them intellectually and building them into your actual environment are completely different acts, and the gap between those two acts is where most attention architecture advice goes to die. The more interesting and less discussed dimension is the temporal one. When during the day you do which kind of work is not a neutral question. The brain's capacity for different cognitive tasks fluctuates significantly across the waking day, following patterns that are partly biological and partly shaped by the accumulated demands of the day's earlier hours. The research on chronobiology, the science of biological timing, suggests that most people have a peak window of 2 to 4 hours during which their capacity for analytic, creative, and complex cognitive work is substantially higher than at other times. For the majority of people, this window falls in the late morning. For a minority, the genuine night owls whose chronotype runs later, it falls in the evening. But wherever it falls, it is finite, and it is not renewable within the same day once it has been spent. The implications of this for how a day should be structured are significant and almost universally violated. The peak cognitive window is precisely the window that most professional cultures fill with meetings. The morning stand-up, the weekly alignment call, the check-in with the manager, because mornings feel like the natural time to coordinate, to communicate, to set the day in motion socially. The result is that the hours of highest cognitive potential are routinely spent in the lowest value cognitive activity. The passive reception of information in group settings, the performance of alignment, the management of social dynamics that could, in most cases, be handled just as effectively in writing at a time that doesn't cost the morning's best hours. The peak window is consumed by coordination, and the actual work gets pushed to the afternoon when the brain is operating on its reserve capacity and everything harder than routine processing becomes disproportionately effortful. Redesigning this requires confronting the social dimension of the attention architecture, the relational agreements about access and availability that govern how other people interact with your time. This is where the work becomes genuinely difficult, because it involves renegotiating norms that are often unspoken and deeply socially embedded. The colleague who expects a response within the hour. The manager whose communication style assumes perpetual availability. The organizational culture that schedules 9 a.m. meetings as a default without examining what that costs in terms of displaced deep work. These are not simply logistical inconveniences. They are structural features of a relational environment, and changing them requires something more than personal discipline. It requires the courage to have explicit conversations about how your best work gets done, and the standing, or the willingness to build the standing, to make those conversations possible. What the people who have built genuinely effective attention architectures tend to have in common is not a single system or a specific set of tools. It is a prior act of clarity. They know what their most important work actually is, not the work that fills the calendar, not the work that other people most visibly appreciate, the work that, if they did it consistently and at the highest level they are capable of, would compound into something extraordinary over time. Everything in the architecture is built backward from that clarity. The protected hours exist to serve that work. The declined meetings are declined in the service of that work. The boundaries around communication exist not as expressions of antisocial preference, but as structural support for the thing they have decided is most worth doing. That clarity is harder to arrive at than any productivity system, and it is more important than all of them combined. It is also not permanent. It requires revisiting, because what matters most changes as a career develops, as capabilities grow, and as the understanding of one's own contribution deepens with experience. The architecture must be rebuilt around each new clarity. But the practice of building it, of asking seriously and repeatedly what deserves the best of my attention, is itself one of the most consequential habits a serious professional can develop. And yet even the most perfectly designed architecture can become a trap if what fills it is not chosen wisely. Because focus, it turns out, has a shadow side that rarely gets discussed honestly. There is a version of the story this audiobook has been telling that ends badly. It is not a hypothetical version. It is well documented. It appears with regularity in the biographies of extraordinarily accomplished people, and it is worth examining with the same seriousness as everything that has come before. The version where protecting your attention becomes a kind of fortress, where singular focus curdles into rigidity, where the discipline that produced exceptional work begins to consume the person doing it. The line between productive obsession and destructive tunnel vision is real, and understanding precisely where it falls is not a peripheral concern for the ambitious person. It is central to the question of whether the kind of focused life this book describes is actually sustainable, or whether it is simply a more disciplined path to a different kind of ruin. Begin with what the research actually shows about the relationship between intense focus and well-being, because it is more nuanced than either the productivity enthusiast or the burnout theorist tends to acknowledge. Studies on expert performance, the kind conducted by Anders Ericsson, whose work on deliberate practice became the foundation for much of what the popular press translated into the 10,000-hour rule, consistently found that the most accomplished performers in every domain practiced intensely. Yes, but they also rested deliberately. Not accidentally, not as a concession to human limitation, but as a structured and non-negotiable component of the performance cycle. The best violinists in Ericsson's landmark study practiced in focused sessions of no more than 90 minutes, took breaks between sessions with genuine seriousness, slept more than their less accomplished peers, and rarely practiced for more than 4 hours in a single day. They were not grinding. They were cycling between intense engagement and genuine recovery, with a discipline applied to both. This cycling is not simply a matter of avoiding physical fatigue. It reflects something fundamental about how the brain consolidates and integrates the gains from focused work. The neuroscience of learning has established that memory consolidation, the process by which new information and skills move from fragile short-term encoding to stable long-term representation, happens largely during rest and sleep, not during active practice. The focused work creates the raw material. The rest is where the integration happens. Skipping the rest does not produce more learning. It produces a kind of diminishing return that eventually becomes negative, where additional focused effort is not simply less effective, but is actively disrupting the consolidation of what has already been done. The person who works through exhaustion in the belief that they are maximizing output is, neurologically speaking, often doing the opposite. But the more insidious form of the problem is not physical exhaustion. It is cognitive and psychological, and it operates through a mechanism that is harder to see because it looks, from the inside, like commitment. The person who has organized their entire identity around a singular focus, who has built their self-concept on the quality of their work, their discipline, their capacity to outperform through sheer sustained attention, is vulnerable to a particular kind of fragility. When the work goes badly, when the project fails, when the market shifts, or the creative well runs dry, or the sustained effort simply doesn't produce the expected outcome, there is nothing else to stand on. The identity has no redundancy. The person who is only their work has no self left when the work disappoints them. This dynamic appears with striking regularity in the histories of people who achieved extraordinary things and then either collapsed, became cruel, or simply stopped growing. The focus that built the achievement became the prison that limited what the achievement could become. Howard Hughes is the extreme case, a man whose capacity for focused, obsessive work produced genuine innovation and whose inability to maintain any identity outside that obsession eventually consumed his humanity entirely. But the dynamic doesn't require that level of extremity to do significant damage. It appears in the executive who has been so focused on building the company that they have no relationships left outside it, and who discovers when the company is sold or the role disappears that they have no idea who they are. It appears in the professional who pursued mastery so single-mindedly that they forgot to develop the emotional range and interpersonal depth that mastery alone cannot supply. The distinction between productive and destructive obsession tends to come down to a few things that are simple to describe and genuinely difficult to practice. The first is the presence of genuine recovery, not passive distraction, but activities that engage different cognitive and emotional systems entirely. Physical movement, deep connection with other people, experiences that produce awe, beauty, or laughter. These are not rewards for good work. They are inputs to it, necessary conditions for the kind of sustained high performance that this audiobook has been describing, without which the system eventually breaks down, regardless of how disciplined the focus has been. The second is identity breadth, the maintenance of a self that is larger than any single role or project. This is not about being less serious or less committed. It is about understanding that the person who can bring their full humanity to their work, who has genuine relationships, genuine interests outside the domain, genuine contact with the ordinary texture of life, tends to produce work that is richer, more resonant, and more durable than the person who has sacrificed everything else at the altar of focus. The world's greatest novelists were not people who only read novels. The world's most innovative scientists were not people who only thought about science. The cross-pollination of a life fully lived is not a distraction from the work. It is frequently the source of what makes the work worth doing. The third, and perhaps the most important, is the ability to hold the work with what the philosopher Simone Weil described as a quality of attention that does not grasp, a focused engagement that is fully present without being desperate for a particular outcome. The person who can work with that quality of attention is not diminished when the work disappoints. They bring curiosity to failure rather than devastation. They adjust, learn, and continue with an equanimity that the person whose identity depends entirely on the outcome cannot access. This is the disposition that makes the quiet obsession truly sustainable. And it is the foundation on which the final picture, the view across decades, becomes visible. There is a thought experiment worth conducting slowly. Imagine two people beginning their professional lives at the same moment, with comparable intelligence, comparable education, and comparable initial opportunity. They enter similar fields, face similar challenges, and possess at the outset roughly equivalent potential. The difference between them is not dramatic. It does not announce itself in the first year or even the third. It is a difference in a single habit of mind, one that is almost invisible from the outside and that neither of them could fully articulate if asked to explain it. One of them has learned, gradually and through a series of private reckonings, to treat their attention as the most valuable thing they have. The other has not. Everything that follows from that single divergence, compounded across 30 years of professional life, is the subject of this final section. Compounding is a concept most people understand in financial terms, where it is dramatic enough to feel almost magical. The way a modest initial investment, grown consistently at a reasonable rate over a long enough period, produces an outcome that dwarfs what any intuitive calculation would have predicted. But compounding operates with equal force in the domain of human capability, and its effects across a career are just as dramatic and just as consistently underestimated. Every hour of genuine deep work produces not just its immediate output, but a residue, a slightly sharper skill, a slightly deeper understanding, a slightly more refined judgment that is carried forward into the next hour of deep work, and the next, and the next. The improvement in any single session is imperceptible. The improvement across a decade is the difference between competence and mastery. Across 2 decades, it is the difference between a career and a legacy. The person who has protected their attention consistently over that period has not simply done more work. They have done qualitatively different work that reflects the accumulated depth of a mind that has been repeatedly exercised at its full capacity, that has developed the ability to hold complex problems patiently, to see further into difficult questions, to make connections that a fragmented mind never had the sustained engagement to reach. This is what genuine expertise actually is at its deepest level. Not the accumulation of information. Information is freely available to anyone with an internet connection, but the development of a particular quality of thinking that only comes from years of focused engagement with hard problems. It cannot be downloaded. It cannot be shortcut. It is built the way all durable things are built, slowly, consistently, and through a process that requires showing up fully again and again over a period of time that tests the commitment. The person on the other side of our thought experiment has not been idle. They have worked hard, perhaps harder in terms of sheer hours logged, but the hours have been fragmented, the focus distributed across too many competing demands, the cognitive energy spent largely in the reactive mode, responding, attending, accommodating, rather than the generative one. Their knowledge base has grown broad, their judgment has developed, but without the depth that comes from sustained immersion in hard problems. Their career has advanced, perhaps significantly, through the social intelligence and collaborative fluency that constant availability tends to develop. But somewhere in the middle years, a gap begins to open. The work they are capable of and the work they are actually producing begins to feel like a distance they can't quite close. The potential that seemed so vivid at the beginning of the journey has not disappeared. It has simply never been fully accessed because the conditions that would have allowed it to develop were never consistently present. This is not a story about failure. It is a story about the difference between a life lived at partial capacity and one lived at full capacity. A distinction that is invisible in any given week and that only becomes legible across the long arc. And what makes it particularly worth examining is that the person in the second scenario is not, in most conventional measures, unsuccessful. They may be prosperous, respected, productive by normal standards. The gap is not between success and failure. It is between what was and what could have been, and that gap is felt most acutely by the person living it, even when they cannot name its source. The people who look, from the outside, like they possess some unusual gift, whose thinking seems to operate at a different level, whose judgment consistently proves sound, whose work carries a quality that is difficult to imitate, are, in the vast majority of cases, not operating from a different intellectual endowment. They are operating from a different relationship with their attention, accumulated over years. The apparent genius is often the compound interest of protected focus. The effortlessness is the result of a discipline so long practiced that it has become invisible, even to the person exercising it. What looks like talent is frequently what deliberate, sustained, uninterrupted engagement produces when it has been given enough time to mature. There is something else that the long view reveals, something about the quality of a life organized around the deep engagement of attention that goes beyond professional achievement. The people who have lived this way tend to describe their work, even work that was difficult and demanding and sometimes unrewarding in the short term, as deeply meaningful. Not because it produced outcomes, though the outcomes were often significant, but because the act of bringing full attention to something, of being genuinely present with a problem, a craft, a question over years, creates a relationship with that thing that is one of the most distinctly human experiences available. It is the experience of knowing something deeply, of having wrestled with it long enough that you understand not just its surface, but its structure, its contradictions, its unexpected beauties. That kind of knowing is not available any other way. It is the exclusive yield of attention given generously and consistently over time. Which brings everything back to the opening question, answered now not as a puzzle, but as a practice. Why do successful people guard their attention like currency? Because they have understood, through experience rather than argument, that attention is not simply a tool for producing output. It is the medium through which a human life is lived at its fullest. To spend it carelessly is not just an efficiency loss, it is a kind of poverty, invisible, voluntary, and entirely avoidable. To spend it well, with intention and discrimination and the quiet ferocity of someone who knows what it is worth, is the closest thing to a complete answer that the question of how to live a significant life has ever produced. The quiet obsession is not really about focus. It is about what focus, sustained over a lifetime, allows a person to become. Word count, 1024. There are no dramatic revelations waiting at the end of a journey like this one. What tends to happen instead is something quieter, a shift in how ordinary moments feel. The morning hour before the world makes its demands. The long stretch of uninterrupted work that produces something you didn't know you were capable of. The conversation where you were genuinely present rather than half somewhere else. These moments don't announce themselves as significant. They rarely feel historic while they're happening. But they accumulate, the way all meaningful things accumulate, through repetition, through patience, through the unremarkable consistency of showing up and giving the best of yourself to the thing that deserves it most. What this audiobook has traced is not a system or a philosophy or a set of rules to follow. It is a recognition, one that different people arrive at through different paths and at different points in their lives, but that tends, once arrived at, to reorganize everything around it. The recognition that your attention is not infinite, that the world competing for it is not neutral, that the people who seem to operate at a different level are, in large part, people who arrived at this recognition earlier and built their lives around it more deliberately, and that the gap between where you are and where that recognition could take you is not a matter of talent or circumstance or luck. It is a matter of a decision, private, ongoing, and available to you at any moment, about what your most finite and most powerful resource is actually for. The quiet obsession begins the moment that decision becomes real.